As the Second World War came to a close in Europe in 1945, things for the German military weren't going too well. With the Soviets advancing in the east and the Allies in the west, the walls were closing in fast, especially for the Kriegsmarine, and more specifically the surface fleet, of which a majority of the larger ships had been sunk already. Still, some units were in more operational condition than others. For instance, the battleship Gneisenau was laid up in Gotenhafen, or what today is Gdynia, to more operational units like the heavy cruiser Lutzow, which was fighting in the Baltic, or the light cruiser Koln in Wilhelmshaven. In today's video, we'll look at some context to how each ship ended up where they did and their respective fates. Starting with the battleship Gneisenau, we're going to pick up her story as she, her sister Scharnhorst, and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen were in the process of completing Operation Cerberus in early 1942, or more famously known as the Channel Dash, where the British made many attempts to stop the ships from traversing the English Channel via land, air, and sea, which for a majority of them weren't successful. The British did find success with their efforts to mind the path the ships were taking, as both Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were hit. An underwater wreck caused further damage to Gneisenau. Though damaged, she was able to make it to Bloemsbutte, where she anchored for a few hours in company with Prinz Eugen, then sailing for the Kiel Canal and onto the Deutsche Werke shipyard in Kiel. This is where information starts to differ about the ship. Some sources, like battleships of the Scharnhorst class, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the backbone of the German surface forces at the outbreak of war, by Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke, have this to say. On February 13th, Gneisenau passed through the Kiel Canal and went immediately into dry dock at the Deutsche Werke. Kriegsmarine standing orders prescribe that before a shipyard layup or entering dry dock, a warship must discharge her stock of ammunition, but for reasons that have never been explained, Gneisenau went into dry dock with her shell rooms and powder magazines full. Less than 2 weeks later, this error would prove fatal. Presumably, the original purpose of the dry docking was merely to allow for a survey of the mine damage before the ship was transferred to Gotenhafen for full repairs. Other sources claim that she had been restocked, repaired, and scheduled for a deployment to Norway in early March 1942, as in Scharnhorst and Gneisenau by Daniel Knowles. Whatever the case may be, the fact remains that the ship had ammunition aboard on the night of February 26th, when overhead came 49 RAF bombers that attacked the battleship in dry dock. She suffered only a single hit that struck the forecastle and penetrated the upper and battery decks, which detonated against the armored deck. This explosion caused a chain reaction in the magazine below A turret. It ignited the powder in the shell cases for the ready-use ammunition. The powder went up in a great jet of flame, and the excess pressure from this lifted A turret and tossed it to the side. All members of the turret's crew were killed, and the final death toll was 112. A catastrophic explosion was avoided only by the immediate flooding of the shell rooms and magazines. The damage to the ship was pretty severe, with the front of the ship being burnt out. Because of that, it was decided that the ship was to be rebuilt and altered, namely replacing the existing 9 28cm or 11-inch guns with 6 38cm or 15-inch guns, something that had been discussed and planned previously before the start of the Second World War, where Knowles writes, "The extensive damage that was sustained by the Gneisenau from the explosion of the forward turret convinced Oberkommando der Marine to rebuild the Gneisenau to mount 6 15-inch guns as had been originally planned, as opposed to simply repairing the ship. Due to the circumstances of the war, it dictated that the repair and rebuilding process could not be carried out at Kiel, as if you've seen my last video in this series, Kiel wasn't the safest place. Instead, the Kriegsmarine decided that the ship should be moved to Gotenhafen to complete the work, where she arrived on April 4th under her own steam, escorted by the pre-dreadnought Schlesien, serving as a cadet training vessel, and the icebreaker Castor, on account of the Baltic being partially frozen at the time. The ship was decommissioned on July 1st, and after that, the rebuilding work began arming her with those 15-inch guns and 3 twin turrets. However, the project was shelved in the early stages of January 1943, as Hitler ordered the cessation of all repair and conversion work. The reason for this was because of the disastrous Battle of the Barents Seas, where the Lutzow and the Admiral Hipper, in company with destroyers, were to attack Allied convoy JW.51B. Due to several factors including weather, the disposition of the German force, poor wording of the operational orders, and of course the enemy escorts, resulted in a defeat for the German forces, including the destruction of the destroyer Friedrich Eckholt, heavy damage to the Admiral Hipper, and no Allied merchant vessels sunk. On January 6, 1943, a meeting was called at Führer HQ to justify Hitler's orders to decommission all heavy units and the cessation of all repairs and conversion work. In his rage, Hitler described the heavy ships as worthless and useless. The order resulted in the resignation of Admiral Erich Raeder, who was replaced by Admiral Karl Dönitz, who got the order partially rescinded. However, the order for the cessation of all repair and conversion work still stood, which, taking from Knowles again, in the wake of this decision, Gneisenau was disarmed and used for spare parts. Reusable parts of the ship were scavenged and used to repair and keep the remaining elements of the Kriegsmarine surface assets operational. One such example being the removal of oil pumps, which were sent to Norway to be fitted to the damaged turrets in early 1944. Subsequently, the guns of the battleship were removed piecemeal for inclusion in coastal batteries. The two surviving triple 11-inch mounts were placed at Bergen and Trondheim in Norway. First, to mount turret B near Bergen, it was necessary to dig around 50 feet vertically into the mountainside. This was considered too time-consuming. A depression in the ground was found instead, and concrete was poured to create a position where the turret could sit. Once the 1,000-pound turret was positioned and fired its first full salvo, it flattened barns in the local area. It is worth noting that some Norwegian prisoners were used in the construction of the turret's new housing. On the other hand, for turret C near Trondheim, she went to form the Osterrot fortress. Again, prisoners were used in the construction, cutting bunkers and tunnels into the hillside to fit and serve the turret. By August 1943, the turret was in place, where it remains till today, being decommissioned in 1968, remaining in a good state of preservation. You can go visit it if you find yourself in the area. Link in the description. It's interesting to note that parts of Turret A were recovered and also used in coastal defenses, while the remaining 5.9-inch turrets were placed in various positions in both Denmark and the Netherlands. Following the war, the Danish reused the guns to help defend against Soviet naval forces in the Baltic, and with the end of the Cold War, the fort lost its strategic importance. Today, you can visit those 5.9-inch guns in Stensfort. There were proposals for 4 of the 6 15-inch guns that were ready for the Gneisenau to be placed in fortifications in Denmark, but nothing came of it. The hulk of the ship was used as a store ship in Gotenhafen, or today what is Gdynia, and frequently used as an air raid bunker on account of the armor, along with other purposes. Nothing of mention occurred in 1944, as the hulk was laid up in Gotenhafen. In late March 1945, the hulk was towed out into the harbor entrance and scuttled as a block ship as the Red Army advanced on the city. To wrap things up, this is what Knowles has to say. The hull of the Gneisenau remained in Gotenhafen until the end of the war. As the Red Army advanced on the city, the remains of the ship were taken out into the entrance of the harbor and scuttled as a block ship on March 27, 1945. The following day, the city fell to Soviet forces and was assigned to local Polish authorities, who renamed the city Gdynia. In 1947, the Polish government ordered that the remains of the Gneisenau be removed from the harbor entrance, prompting salvage operations to begin. The hull was scaled and refloated on September 12, 1951, before being towed away to be scrapped. It is believed that some of the steel from the Gneisenau was subsequently used in the construction of Polish merchant vessels. When she was refloated on September 12, 1951, the Gneisenau was the largest ship to ever be raised. Next on our list is Germany's first Panzerschiff, Deutschland, renamed Lützow during the war. After the Battle of the Barents Sea in early 1943, Lützow remained in northern Norway. However, after this failure on January 6 at Führer HQ, Hitler ordered the decommissioning of all heavy units, resulting in the resignation of Admiral Raeder, being replaced by Admiral Dönitz, who managed to have the decommissioning order partially rescinded. In March, Lützow was shifted to Alta Fjord as Tirpitz and Scharnhorst arrived in Bogen Bay. For the next several months, she did not see action as she had problems with her diesel. This caused problems as she was to be battle-ready at all times. Repairs were carried out and she participated in group exercises in July and August. In September, she began the return journey to Germany in stages and made it to the Baltic port of Gotenhafen, with Captain Stange stepping down in November. Captain Konke was appointed her commander in January as an overhaul continued on the ship. The cruiser began working up in March with a full war complement of 1,156 officers and men aboard. After working up, she joined the fleet training group with Prinz Eugen, Admiral Scheer, Nürnberg, Emden, torpedo boats, E-boats, and the gunnery target ship Hessen. With summer came shore bombardment practice and battle training in the Gulf of Finland, as it was feared that Finland might leave the war, which the nation soon did. On July 8th, Lützow took part in the last naval review of German warships. The following week saw Lützow hoping to protect German land units falling back following the departure of Finland from the war. As the calendar changed to fall, Lützow, much like the remaining heavy units, began shore bombardments against Soviet forces in Memel near the Schwab Peninsula. In one day, expending well over 1,000 shells from her various guns. The naval units worked in rotations, returning to Gotenhafen to rearm. Schwab had fallen by the time she was relieved by the Admiral Scheer on the 23rd of November. Lützow escaped the devastating bombing of the port city of Gotenhafen in mid-December and moved to Pilau towards the month's end. From February onward, Lützow, Admiral Scheer, and Prinz Eugen worked in rotation to bombard Soviet forces in East Prussia, which on the 8th of that month, escorted by T-8, T-28, and T-33, she bombarded Soviet advance columns off the coast. German defenders in the area were crumbling as a column of refugees hindered their fighting ability. She continued her rotations of shore bombardments and rearming, helping to defend Gotenhafen and other ports, managing to survive several bombing attacks at Swinemunde until the 16th of April, when a British Lancaster bomber achieved a near miss and opened up a large hole on the side of the ship, and she assumed a 56-degree list. Two 1,000-pound bombs also hit the ship in the forward and aft main battery magazines, failing to detonate. She was hit in shallow water, and therefore, with the help of a salvage vessel, she was restored to an even keel, where the starboard 5.9-inch guns and A turret were pumped dry, and by the 28th, she resumed the bombardment of Soviet land forces. Her last commander, Captain Ernst Lange, was appointed in April. By that time, only gunnery personnel remained on the cruiser, as the rest of the crew had been formed into emergency infantry units. Once all the ammunition had been expended, and it was clear that the situation could not improve, the order was given to scuttle the ship. On the 3rd or 4th of May, scuttling charges were set, and she was sunk in place. The eventual fate of the wreck is not known for certain. Some say she was seen at Kronstadt in 1948 and 1949, while it's more likely this was the Admiral Hipper-class vessel sold to the USSR. Other sources report that she capsized and sank off Kolberg while under tow, or that she was used in weapons tests. Whatever the case may be, the Lützow is no longer around, and therefore sunk in some manner following the war. The last ship we're going to cover today is the light cruiser Köln, a ship we haven't discussed on the channel. Now, if you've watched my videos on the other German light cruisers, you'd understand that the ships of the Königsberg class were structurally weak and unstable, and therefore couldn't act as commerce raiders. I don't want to go into too much detail here, as you can see that in my video on Karlsruhe, as that's the most recent. Anyway, our story with Köln picks up in March of 1942, when Korvettenkapitän Helmut Strobel became Köln's 8th acting commander, where between February 5th and May 23rd, his ship was fitted out with structural and equipment upgrades. By the time she was fitted out in Wilhelmshaven yards, she was on to her 9th commander, for her forthcoming deployment to Norway. She sailed on July 3rd for Norway, first stopping in Oslo, and arriving on August 6th to relieve the Lützow. On September 10th, she moved to Altafjord, where Klaus-Peter Schmolke and Gerhard Koop, in German light cruisers of World War II, warships of the Kriegsmarine, report. Because of her poor seakeeping and heavy conditions, she was not very useful for operations and was there mainly to make up the numbers, rarely straying from her various anchorages. Following the decommissioning order we've talked about so much in January 1943, she was moved to Kiel, where her ensign was hauled down on February 17th. Things for the cruiser picked back up in January 1944 as the Wehrmacht retreated from the east. There was a need for the Kriegsmarine to support them from seaward, and therefore, numerous decommissioned units were taken into service again, including Köln. She was towed from Kiel to Königsberg to be made seaworthy, and was so by April 1st, when Strobel took command once again. She didn't emerge from the docks until July 1st, attached to the training division as a cadet training ship. In October, she was loaded with 90 mines and sailed to Oslo with 2 destroyers, where we're going to take a long excerpt found in light cruisers, as they have the first-hand account of her last chief engineer, Korvettenkapitän Haya. He writes, "On Saturday, September 30th, 1944, I relinquished my post to my successor at Hohenschwange, and after a 15-day journey, my marching orders were embellished with 12 visas. I found Köln on October 14th at Horten, the naval base at the entrance to Oslo Fjord. She had been reactivated after a long period out of commission and belonged to the Fleet Training Group. She was a clapped-out light cruiser built before 1930. All of her wiring was to have been replaced in 1939. Only her sister Karlsruhe had had this done by the time war came. Consequently, there was about 200 kilometers of brittle cabling, and electrical malfunctions were daily occurrences. My predecessor had brought this to the attention of the commander. The latter had never submitted an official defect report during the AR and took the chief engineer's complaints personally. The chief had been drafted, and I was his replacement. 2 days after my arrival, he packed his bags. That same evening, I had to prepare for the mine-laying operation. Köln, Emden, and the destroyers Karl Glaster, Richard Benson, and Friedrich Inn were to lay the Augustus minefield. 4 air raids by between 25 and 40 bombers over the period of October 15th through the 20th put paid to the operation. I looked at the ship's company. I knew none of my watch engineers or ERAs. The ship was overcrewed. There were 900 men aboard with a peacetime complement of 520. Even after the change of cadets, there were still about 800, of which 260 were seaman branches and 90 engineer cadets. The officer corps was overstrength, and I had 12 subordinate engineer officers instead of the usual 6, mostly young men who had been trained for U-boats but were no longer required. There were even junior lieutenants who had been retrained in 6 months from coastal artillery to the seaman branch. My watch officers had all come up through the ranks. The executive officer had entered the Imperial Navy in 1916 and had little shipboard experience. This meant that the commander and I were the only officers aboard who had gone through the normal, unforced peacetime naval training course. How different things were from the heady years of 1941. Engine plants liable to break down at any moment, an officer corps thrown together, disgruntled worn officers who had not been able to obtain a commission. In the weeks after the abandoned mining operation, the ship just lay in the fjord with the mines still on her decks, changing anchorages each evening once the British reconnaissance aircraft of the day had gone home. We ran a few troopship escorts in the fjord. We were stringent about conserving fuel. In November 1944, after grounding near Horten, we went into the floating dock at Oslo. The executive officer was summoned ashore on some pretext and taken to Akershus fortress. He had been involved in the July 20th bomb plot in some way. Fortunately for him, he did not come to trial before the end of the war. We landed our 90 mines at Fredrikstad on the night of December 13th towards 7 p.m. Both fighters from No. 5 Group Bomber Command attacked. Our flak opened up, and after the usual Tannenbaum, the bombs came. No direct hits, but a lot of near misses about 10 meters from the hull, causing engine damage that Oslo Yard could not repair. During the attack, we had only one boiler with steam up, and the cruise diesel was coupled to the propeller so that we could make a quick getaway in an emergency. The anchor was heaved straight away, the machine telegraph was put to slow ahead. Nothing happened. There was insufficient air pressure to start up the diesels. Meanwhile, the bombs were whistling down. The electrical plant had finally had it and more or less just collapsed. Even the emergency lighting was only a feeble glimmer. Using pocket flashlights, the stokers lit boilers with all jets and forced steam up, something that was permitted only in an emergency and ignoring all safety regulations. And within a few minutes, we had full steam pressure to sail. As there was no current, the turbines couldn't be coupled to the drive shafts, which were still hooked up to the diesel. The air raid lasted about 20 minutes. Finally, we got current from the generators and moved off. We used a cruising compass because it took a while to get the gyro compass working again after an electrical failure. There was a magnetic compass, but for some reason this wasn't working. The British attacked again a few minutes into the new year. Again, they registered no direct hits, but many near misses caused serious blast damage, forcing us to dry dock in Oslo. An army of sentries armed to the teeth surrounded the ship to protect her against sabotage. As it was very foggy, they fired a volley into the air every so often. The repairs at Oslo were unsatisfactory, and on January 4th, we headed for Wilhelmshaven. Hopefully you found that as interesting as I did. Anyway, in late January, the executive officer was made captain, as the captain had been ordered east. The remaining months and days of Koln service were filled with near-continual air raid warnings, as the crew would retreat to a large bunker in the vicinity. The bunker was hit on March 30th, and with a few dead and wounded. Before the all-clear signal was given, the crew was given the order to the ship to fight fires and salvage personal effects from the stem of the cruiser. Although the fires were not too serious, it was impossible to enter the after section because the cruiser had a huge list and was in danger of capsizing. Therefore, everybody got to shore quickly. Haya lost everything except the uniform he was wearing at the time. The crew were given quarters in nearby barracks and given clearing up work over Easter. After that, they were kitted out fresh on April 5th and left Wilhelmshaven to fight on land. Meanwhile, the cruiser sank on an even keel in the yard basin and was decommissioned on April 5th. The cruiser was upright with both B and C turrets above the water. A party of technicians and weapons personnel remained behind at Wilhelmshaven. Flying cables were run out to turret B, and the turret was ready to use with the assistance of a wooden platform. The 15-centimeter guns bombarded enemy tanks and allied positions around the port city. After the capitulation of Germany, the wreck was broken up piecemeal when the shipyard was dismantled. The remains were raised in 1956 during the rebuilding of the naval arsenal. I hope you all found this video interesting. After the success of the last video, I figured I'd take a look at some other ships at the end of the Second World War. In the future, I'd like to make some other videos to look at other ships like the destroyers found in Kiel, or other ships like the Graf Zeppelin or Tirpitz. Anyway, please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.